Good morning and welcome to Highfield Community Church, our weekly message. We're again broadcasting this along with many other churches around the town and many churches across the country. And it occurs to me that there are probably more words of God, more scriptures flying through the ether, being broadcast. People have a greater access than ever before, so perhaps our isolation is not all bad. But I want to welcome you, I want to encourage you, I want to share the word with you. We're going to be looking at the scriptures to a story that you perhaps know reasonably well, the story of David and Goliath. And if you care to turn to your own Bibles, we find the story in 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's a long chapter, and I'm going to read portions of it. I'm going to read, first of all, the first 24 verses. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Socoh in Judah. They pitched camp at Ephes-dammim, between Socoh and Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah, and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. The Philistines occupied one hill, and the Israelites another, with a valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and wore a coat of scale armour of bronze, weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." On hearing this, the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. We have the story of two armies drawn up confronting each other across the valley. It's a contest of not two armies, but it was decided to be a contest between two champions. And we're introduced to the protagonists. We've got Goliath on the one hand, and it says he came from Gath. Now, if we read earlier in the Old Testament, when the Israelites were spying out the promised land, they reported that around that area there were a population of gigantic figures. So there was probably more people like Goliath who came from Gath. And he had a big history. He was probably fighting battles long before David was born. And David was a boy, not old enough to have much of a history himself at all. And we read about the dramatic challenge. This was more than just an army challenging each other. It went on for 40 days. Can you imagine how the Israelites felt? Morning and night. Their day began with insults. Their day ended in failure. They were being shamed. They wouldn't come out and fight him. It's a fairly long chapter. I said we're not going to read all of it. But I do urge you, this story is so interesting. It's got so many details. This is about real people, their names. The detail illustrates the reality of the story, what people were doing, how they felt, the situation that they were in. I do urge you to read chapter 17 yourself, but we're going to dip in to at least half of it, and it's full of details. We know the outcome, that David actually kills the giant with one stone. And in one way, the story has a certain simplicity. The Philistines were on one side, and they were arrogant, derisive, warlike, ungodly people. And in fact, it's become a synonym for barbarianism. It's not a good thing to call something nowadays, to accuse them of being a Philistine. They were ungodly people and very arrogant, warlike. David, on the other hand, was a picture of purity. He was young, idealistic and righteous. And it occurs to me that perhaps this story might be the origin of the pantomimes that we go to every Christmas. You know, the moral stories of good versus bad. Those who wish to harm us get their comeuppance. The bad is defeated and punished, and the hero gets his reward. But there's rather more going on here than a simple pantomime story. The Israelites didn't exactly cover themselves in glory. They might even unkindly have been accused of cowardice. They might well have not turned up. They might not have been there. And why was that? If you read the history of the Exodus, they'd fought many a battle. It wasn't a strange situation for them to be in. They'd won many battles. They'd fought many battles before. And there's a passage in the book of Deuteronomy as to the reason, their strategy for winning battles. Moses gave them these instructions from God, direct from the mouth of God. He instructed the armies of Israelites, the Israelite people. Moses said, when you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid. Because the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, will be with you. When you are about to go into battle, the priest shall come forward and address the army. He shall say, hear, O Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not be terrified or give way to panic before them. Because the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you victory. They were God's army. They had great resources behind them. So they were used to fighting. They weren't deterred by the size of the army before them, but they were overawed by one man. A pretty impressive man, it might be said. Impressive in appearance, loud in voice. Battle-trained, battle-scarred. He was confident and charismatic. And secretly I can see why they would be afraid of this one man. I can understand why nobody wanted to go one-to-one with him. Look at the statistics. He looked unbeatable. It depends which version of the Bible you read, but in measurements that we can understand, this man was round about 10 foot tall, at least 3 meters tall, verging on the 10 foot. His armour weighed 57 kilograms. Now that's about 10 times the size and the weight of a plastic pack of potatoes that you buy at the supermarket. His spearhead alone weighed 7 kilograms, and he was carrying all this weight and still able to move in battle, to move quite nimbly, to move quite fast. And he was absolutely brimming with attitude. No one man would take the risk. And each man took comfort in the fact that nobody else was standing forward either. They were all hiding in the crowd. And they were stuck in defeatism. They dared not go forward. The army dared advance because they'd come up against Goliath and perhaps more of his kind. They couldn't retreat for the fear of being overrun. But how long could this standoff last? How long could they stay there before the enemy got bold enough to advance? They were stuck fast, mentally defeated. They'd lost sight of the fact that they were God's chosen people, that God had promised to be with them in battle. God was directing them who to fight, where to fight, how to fight. They'd lost sight of that. They were mentally demoralized and defeated. I want to turn to a section later on in the chapter, from verse 40 to verse 50. David took his shepherd's bag and his staff in hand. He chose 5 smooth stones from the stream and put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag. And with his sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was only a boy, ruddy in complexion and handsome. And he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. Today I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David quickly ran towards the Philistine, the battle line, to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, without a sword in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine and killed him. It took a young boy full of idealism to break the deadlock. He was unprotected by any helmet or breastplate. He was lightly armed, and much is made of his youth. It's mentioned several times. He was the youngest of 8 brothers, really too young for military service. Therefore, he'd had no training. But he had faith. His faith had given him courage. And he testified that he had defended his father's sheep flocks from wild animals. And in verses 45 and 46, he claimed victory in God's name. And here's the nub of the story. It's not a simple parable of a battle between 2 armies. This was God's people being insulted by barbarians who mocked their God, who mocked their chosen people's status. This was a battle, a spiritual battle. So David went into battle claiming victory for God, by God. His natural courage displayed in killing wild animals was God's preparation for him. It wasn't just a new situation. He had trained in the use of his weapons, the staff and the sling. He was ready for this moment, physically and spiritually, because he was in communion with God. His trust was in God, and that was the source of his courage and power. He knew with all his heart that he could not lose. He knew that he would not lose. And we come up to the fact that God is mightier than any power on earth or in heaven. Isaiah the prophet stated God's word, "Heaven is my home and earth is my footstool." How far do you reckon it is between heaven and earth? God is mighty. We go back to the beginning of the chapter, 2 armies with a valley in between. The lowest place in the valley was where the battle would be. And that's where our battles take place, at our lowest ebb. The enemy wants us to focus on what we see, and he wants us to be discouraged. At the moment, we're in the valley with COVID-19. It's a serious illness, and we're worried. Its effects are widespread. It's affecting all our lives, every single one of us. This is the giant that we face. It's large. It's frightening. And we responded in fear initially, instead of faith. In times like this, our mind is capable of taking us to the heights and to the depths, both very closely in succession. We imagined the worst scenario. When we walked into supermarkets and saw empty shelves, the stock was running short, whatever it was, bread, milk, toilet paper even, we realized suddenly that we must have these things. And what if we're isolated for weeks, even months? But the Bible, again, is where we should turn for reassurance. The Bible tells us, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Just like David did. It's not that he was particularly wise, but he was in touch with God, and God was in touch with him. The Bible again teaches that God has not given us a spirit of fear, because fear imprisons us, but faith liberates. Fear disheartens us, but faith encourages us. Fear is everything that's negative and defeatist. Faith builds and strengthens. And when we think about it, fearful people create fear in those around them. Words like pandemic make us fearful because it's unseen, unknown. But it's not beyond God's power, and neither was Goliath. God could have acted directly against Goliath. He's bigger, certainly. But God works through people. We've said this before. God works through people. David had to work to overcome his fear and trust in God. And David was the one who actually had to take action. Now I came across a true story. In 1527, in a town called Wittenberg in Germany, this is where the reformer Martin Luther lived. A plague hit the town, and Martin Luther brought infected people into his own home. You might have thought this was quite foolish. This is where his wife was, his family. He was putting people at risk. But much like David, his first recourse was a prayer for protection. Having invoked God's power in his home, in his life, he rolled up his sleeves and went to work caring for those who were suffering, giving nursing care and medication to those who were in need, bathing their brows, being with them, reassuring them. God can cure COVID-19, but he works through people. And we are actually seeing acts of courage, compassion, support. And we will see more encouragement as we trust God more. Here's another story. This one's not so true. There was a mouse. Being a mouse, he was terrified of cats. So he went to see a magician. And the magician turned him into a cat. Now that was all very well until he met a dog. So he was changed into a dog. Then he came across something even bigger, a tiger. And he had to be changed into a tiger. Frequent visits to the magician. But when this tiger met a hunter, he went back to the magician again. But this time the magician turned the tiger back into a mouse. And he said, you may have had the body of a tiger, but you still have the heart of a mouse. An obvious conclusion to that story. Action is required, courage is required. Romans 8 says, you are more than conquerors. And that's reassuring to know that we are more than we think we are if we put our trust in God. That's always conditional. The power belongs to the Lord. So how do we do this? How do we walk in faith and not fear? We must face the enemy. Face our fears. Take control of it. We mustn't cuddle our fears. We mustn't give it house room. David didn't sit around thinking what might be, what might happen. He didn't use weapons that he wasn't used to. He fought with what he had, a staff and a sling and faith. Don't overlook that element. He used what he had. And in our lives, we often say, if only I had this or that, if I had more money, I could do something. If I had more power, if I had more education and knew what to do, if we had more, we could manage better. But accept that God chooses us as we are and uses us with what we have. It may not be enough in our own eyes, but that's why we need to use God's power. It's God who has the victory. And in verse 46, David claimed that victory. David knew who was the victor, whose honour he was fighting for, whose power he was tapped into. When issues facing the nation, with these issues that are facing the nation, we can't meet every need. We've seen that in the newspapers. There's not enough people. There's not enough protection. There's not enough for hospitals. There's not enough for nursing homes. How are parents coping at home with homeschooling their children? There's not enough of anything. We can't cope. That's proven. We can't cope, except by relying on God. The pandemic has brought our need of God's power in our lives to our attention. We have the opportunity, we have the time to enter into a deeper relationship and learn not to be afraid. Take that opportunity. I urge you to take that opportunity to have a relationship with a powerful, living God, to have a deeper relationship with God. I finish with a final word from the scriptures. In Deuteronomy, we are encouraged by the fact that the Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. I pray that you might find comfort, that you might find the ability to cope through the scriptures. I pray that you will have a good week with whatever faces you, that your strength might encourage you to strengthen those around you. I encourage you to not only take your faith and your strength, but to share it, to look for opportunities of giving other people, sharing the courage that you have yourself. Look for opportunities to befriend, to help. Look for an opportunity to do a random act of kindness. And as the weeks go on, the time is getting nearer when we will be able to meet again, when we will be able to look each other in the eye, when we will be able to have physical contact and reassure each other. Until that time, God bless you.